Hello and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Carrot Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 2011 period action mystery movie titled Sherlock Holmes, A Game of Shadows. Now, Sherlock Holmes, A Game of Shadows runs for 2 hours and 9 minutes long. It is directed by Guy Ritchie. It is produced by Joel Silver, Lionel Wigram, Susan Downey, and Dan Lin. The script was written by Michelle and Kieran Mulrooney. It is based off of the novel Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. The score was composed by Hans Zimmer, the cinematography by Philippe Rousselat, and it was edited by James Herbert. And the stars of the movie are Robert Downey Jr., Jude Law, Noomi Rapace, Jarrett Harris, Eddie Marsan, Rachel McAdams, Stephen Fry, Kelly Reilly, Paul Anderson, Geraldine James, Thierry Neuvic, Fatima Adoum, Wolf Kahler, and Affif Ben Badra. There are so many good qualities about the sequel to Sherlock Holmes, A Game of Shadows, but that can be quite overwhelming. From the direction to the acting to the production values, the score, the editing, and the cinematography all deliver what a movie needs to keep the fans occupied and make their time worthwhile. And boy, did they really step up in this sequel. I thought that there was never a dull moment. There was always a great level of intrigue, a lot of suspense, a lot of quick-paced action here. And I even think it may have exceeded the quality of action and pacing quite substantially from the previous Sherlock Holmes movie. But the biggest flaw from the first of the franchise was the convoluted mystery and the unconvincing villain that was Lord Blackwood, played by Mark Strong. Although, even though Blackwood is not in this movie, but still, you see, this is where the first film where it had its flaws. Here we see a great improvement in terms of the mystery elements. Even though the mystery elements is not there, it kind of like is replaced by action set pieces, which might satisfy the action lovers, but to those who love like the old classic traditional Sherlock Holmes, with either Basil Rathbone or Jeremy Brett starring in this one, where we're actually more or less solving mysteries and not necessarily seeing all kinds of explosive stuff like we see in this movie. Well, fans, purists will sadly, unfortunately, be disappointed because you won't see a pure, solid Sherlock Holmes movie like the old school classic Basil Rathbone adaptations. You won't see any of that. Instead, you'll be seeing more action-packed scenes and less mystery or espionage. While everything else worked in the first movie, the diabolical elements featured there were a bit gossamer at times. And sure, in A Game of Shadows, the film is presented rather lightly in its approach, in which the villain, Professor James Moriarty, played by Jarrett Harris, the motives behind his evil schemes are far more complex and threatening. That Europe is hanging in a balance of either resisting or starting a potential war. Well, if you actually know the time periods, maybe a lot of the stuff that Moriarty had pointed out were preludes or the ideas of a potential deadly war is not far behind. I mean, knowing the time period, it took place in the late 1890s. And what was the next biggest war that happened? Definitely the War of the Worlds. And I'm talking about World War I. which was an event that took place between 1914 to 1918. Europe was, maybe back in the late 1890s, Europe was actually, on unsettling terms. It, of course, spread from a lot of friction, a lot of animosity, and a lot of hostilities within the European countries, which contributed to World War I. And maybe Professor James Moriarty is not too much off his rocker, so to speak. This, of course, definitely makes a more formidable adversary for both Sherlock Holmes, played by Robert Downey Jr., and Dr. John Watson, played by Jude Law, to go up against. The film itself leans towards a more political and intellectual plot. The pacing might be a bit slower, but it never once meanders, let alone lacks in excitement or action. Aside from the political aspects of the Game of Shadows, we have two prominent subplots that stay legitimate the whole way through and adds more depth to the characters. We see the marriage of Watson and his new wife, Mary Marsan, played by Kelly Reilly, where we've left with Holmes hesitating at the notion, fearing that his partnership with Watson will be gone forever. That it's time for Watson to sort of, step up, enjoy the realms of love and marriage. And, I guess you can also feel a little bit of sadness towards Holmes, because you see, Holmes in the history has never really ever engaged in any kind of female companionship. But sometimes we even question if whether or not he was, a hopeless romantic heterosexual, a laid-back asexual, or maybe there is a possibility that he may even have some kind of seductive lust towards Watson himself, since it seems like Holmes and Watson are pretty much an item together, like fish and chips and peanut butter and jelly, and maybe even ships and water. You can't have a boat without water. Can you? Of course not. So that's kind of like what we kind of feel inside of Sherlock Holmes' psyche. Because, let's face it, it's possibility that Watson doesn't need Holmes, but it is perfectly clear, and especially in this story, that Holmes cannot solve mysteries without Watson. In the end, he would probably be just some lowly mystery-solving recluse with no one else. Watson is his muse. Watson is his inspiration. Watson is what helps him solve mysteries. But without Watson, Holmes is actually up Schitt's Creek without a paddle. Whereas Watson, he could probably feel free to go off on his own. But Holmes is much more vulnerable to that, and we see that in this narrative. Some people might say there might have been some kind of some levels of homoeroticism within the narrative of Sherlock Holmes. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with that. Just to let you know anything, if Sherlock Holmes happens to actually be gay, I got no objections. But according to stories by Sir Conan Arthur Doyle, we are all led to believe that Sherlock Holmes might be just some guy dedicated to his work and is probably just maybe at most an asexual. Neither gay, straight, or bi. So you do get to see some of that angst within him. I've always thought that Holmes was described as being emotionless, gung-ho on his job, and a guy who doesn't really exude too much emotion in the work he does, even though he's enthusiastic, he's dedicated, and he's able to get the job done no matter how tough the mysteries are. But also at the same time in this movie we see a vulnerable side to Sherlock Holmes. So in this sequel, Holmes has learned to accept that Watson is happily married and has accepted his lonely life to some extent. Although Watson may have found true happiness, we also tend to realize that Holmes is a man with a lot of enemies, and might even have some form of emptiness. And we also discover that Holmes definitely does have a lot of enemies. Not just Moriarty, not just Blackwood, but probably a whole crop full of them. But also at the same time, to counteract the fact that he's got a lot of adversaries, Watson also knows that Holmes really has very few true allies, and definitely comes to realize that Holmes needs Watson more than Watson needs Holmes. We definitely do have that great chess matchup between Holmes and Moriarty, and shows that in the battle of wits, Moriarty can be just as cunning and clever as Holmes, and Holmes knows that he's not just some run-of-the-mill criminal baddie, but this guy is a villain, and not just a threat towards Holmes, but a threat for the sake of humanity. The guy lives a double life. On the one hand, he's a brilliant, intellectual math professor, brilliant to the core, seems to be a real prodigal genius. Definitely knows the ways around the classrooms, but when he's not putting up complex equations on the board for us to solve, he's out planting bombs, blowing up cities, causing nothing but terror and fear throughout every step he walks on. He is just unpredictable, uncanny, and just evil to the core. And it doesn't take physical strength, it doesn't take muscle to beat down Moriarty, but it takes down a joint that is or should be much stronger than the muscles in your arms, and that is the muscles in your brains. And if you don't have strong muscles in your brains to defeat Moriarty, well then Moriarty's just going to continue his reign of terror, and there's very little that people can do to stop him. There definitely is a myriad of symbolism depicted in the whole movie that the first installment truly lacked in. Such symbolism includes the demon-like portrayal of Moriarty's psyche, the anecdote between the fisher and the trout, as I have already mentioned, the chess pieces. The symbols represent the emphasis of what's being featured here, and the battle of good versus evil between Holmes and Moriarty, and the eternal bonding between Holmes and Watson. These two narratives really truly come into place here, and never once do they ever meander off into two separate subplots. They seem to somewhat intertwine with each other. Sure, there's a lot of friction between Holmes and Watson, but it's definitely, they still provide some good chemistry. Even though Watson seems to be back in the thick of things with Holmes being caught in the middle, still I found some great chemistry, especially from actors Robert Downey Jr. and Jude Law. So make no doubts about it, the acting is at the very best featured here. Downey still has that juvenile humor that he did in the first installment. He's putting on all kinds of pretty cool, wacky disguises, whether it be dressing up like a woman, camouflaging to the scenery, wearing kind of like color coordinated apparel to match, even the upholstery of whatever settings is. It seems like he always seems to have some kind of omnipresence in him whenever danger is lurking around. And it's always fun to watch. There's great levels of action and humor and espionage. And of course, there's just almost like a James Bond movie. You see a lot of country hopping. 1 minute he's in England. Next minute he's in France. Next minute he's in Germany. And here we see Holmes having more human-like features like anger and fear, making Holmes seem less like a cartoon character and more like a human being, knowing that evil lurks when Moriarty is on the loose. Also, many of the old Basil Rathbone adaptations have often made Holmes into almost like a near-perfect human being, while Robert Downey Jr. tends to make Sherlock Holmes into a far less than perfect individual. He'll make mistakes, he'll make flaws, but in the end, he always pulls through. And of course, in the battle between good versus evil, good will conquer evil, like in most cases. Sure, the film definitely has some more darker themes to it. It assures you that Holmes isn't the unwatchable character that everyone has him out to be. Jude Law definitely adds a touch of it to his Watson character as the slightly smarter character than Holmes, and how we feel for him that he needed a break from assisting Holmes in solving crimes. We feel bad for him that he's being caught in the middle of something he didn't want to take part in, but in the end, he does. We gravitate to his sacrifices when he agrees to return once again to assist Holmes. We see that he's not obligated to help Holmes, but doing it for the sake of friendship, knowing that Holmes just can't solve mysteries on his own, and that he does need at least one ally to help him out. Stephen Fry may not have enough screen time as Holmes' older brother Mycroft, but he does possess some well-intended comic relief with a personality that is both eccentric and effective, except I really don't think I want to actually look at Stephen Fry's naked rear end ever again. Please keep your clothes on, Mr. Fry. But definitely the real star of the show comes the villainy of Professor Moriarty, played effectively by Jared Harris, who of course is the son of the late actor and the original actor to play Dumbledore in the Harry Potter movies, Richard Harris. Jared Harris definitely is probably doing his father proud. His father's probably looking down on him from heaven with a big smile on his face. Jared Harris as Professor Moriarty was spot on and just stole every scene that he's in. Jared Harris is not like in a lot of movies. He's not a big name star, but he really definitely pulled it off. And he just is the Moriarty that I would have expected. He might come off as a very well-spoken, benevolent individual, but underneath he lives a double life. On the one hand, he's a college professor. On the other side of life, he's a dangerous sociopath with a mindset on terrorism and warmongering. Human collateral is something he couldn't care less about. His usually calm demeanor gets put to the challenge when he performs a torturous scene brilliantly backed up by opera music, which was unsettling like it was meant to be. A lot of the set pieces A lot of the score and the editing and the production design is just perfectly spot on. And it adds a lot of ambience to the dark atmosphere that this movie is definitely saturated in. The camera work in this film was definitely well crafted due to a lot of care put into it. So aside from the well nuanced camera work, the sets, the locations, the costumes are all a visual delight. Under the direction from Guy Ritchie, he does so that the style and the substance can be equally proportioned so that one does not just outweigh the other. If I want to see a movie, I want to see both style and substance. Is that too hard to ask? I don't think so. A Game of Shadows does not get to you right away, but the slow build-up will definitely pay dividends in the end. The slow start showcases the character's psyche and the mental state of Holmes, and that he has become more conflicted than ever before. The fight scenes are engaging, and though many traditionalists might scoff that there were too many fighting scenes than solving mysteries, those who gravitate to the Basil Rathbone classic golden age black and white movies from the 40s, well, this is mostly just to appease modern day fans who like their actions quick paced and not about character development or subtlety. It's still an effective way of knowing that what Holmes is up against goes beyond the parameters of solving mysteries alone. In that final half hour of the movie leading up to the climax, the action scenes are definitely truly quite epic, but they're also very exciting to watch. With the use of slow motion scenes, the action scenes are edgier and are more intense, and the outcome can be quite rewarding, especially where Holmes and Moriarty take an epic fall and only one will likely survive. Who? I don't know. Actually, I do know, but I will leave it up to you, so to avoid spoiler alert. Sure, the ending is something for all you to see. It does leave you with a satisfying aftertaste that will definitely be worth the watch. And that we hope that the new Sherlock Holmes movie coming out this year actually. It's supposed to be coming out around near Christmas time. It was just as exciting as the sequel, or it might even come out around January of 2022. The only thing I can say about this movie is only time will tell if whether this movie is going to be a success or will it be a failure. We just have to wait and see. But I gotta say that this movie definitely has it all. It's got, the acting is really good, the score was really good, the cinematography was spot on, the settings look just like you would expect from 19th century Europe. It's got a lot of espionage, it's got a lot of fight scenes, it's almost like a 19th century version of James Bond. There's definitely a lot of interesting, intriguing stuff, a lot of philosophy, the acting is excellent. Like the characters who I've mentioned before, everything just seems to just fall into place. It's a really good movie. I highly recommend it. If I was to give this movie a scale out of 10, I would definitely give Sherlock Holmes: The Game of Shadows a 9. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my YouTube channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. But just remember the 3 simple rules. Be kind, be courteous, and please refrain from any rude comments, and I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Correct Writer saying keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.